G'day everyone, Dicko here with another kick-ass walkthrough. As a first in many animation videos to come, I'm going to walk through 3 easy steps that you can follow to get started on animating your very own ball bounce. Firstly, yes, this will be a 2D animation, and secondly, yes, this will still be using Blender, albeit using the grease pencil. Thirdly, yes, this method is software agnostic, meaning you can try this method with any other software like Photoshop, Adobe Animate, Toon Boom, Procreate, or whatever the fuck you want to try it out in. And finally, no, I will not be doing a 3D animation in this video. If you're wondering why, then check out my previous video on the subject of animation. This is a springboard for you to grasp the essentials of animation, how to plan a shot, how to time it out, and finally how to execute on it. And I can guarantee you this, it's much easier to get a handle on these concepts without adding a whole third dimension to the whole ordeal. I will cover a 3D ball bounce in the next video. One last thing to mention is that this is an animation tutorial, not a grease pencil tutorial. So I'm not going to go through every nitty-gritty detail on how to use that tool set. I would recommend, if you want to learn about using grease pencil, that you check out the Blender YouTube channel directly, because I have a full-on tutorial series on how to use it. And of course, if you want to download the source files from this video, feel free to sign up for my Patreon, where I have access to not only ad-free content, but the source files from any video that I've published in the last few months and any published videos that I'll make in the future. So feel free to check that out. Okay, so let's just get started and jump right in. Starting with step 1, planning and staging. Now, I'm going to rate this by brain power required, and that is around 70% in my opinion, where it's not too difficult, but you may need to turn off the music in the background to help you concentrate. And this is all about planning, staging, and timing out your animation without actually animating anything. So what I want you to do is to start off by working out your arcs. And you can do this in a bunch of ways in Blender. I'm using the line tool here to do that inside the grease pencil, converting that to a curved grease pencil line, and I'm trying to get my arcs nice and smooth, so something that looks like a ball bounce. And because I'm doing a ball bounce which actually slows down over time, I'm making sure that the arcs reduce in both distance and in height over time as well, so we get a nice natural looking arc of motion, line of motion. Again, we're working with the 12 principles of animation here as well. So arcs are part of that list. So what you're going to do is try and get an arc or a series of arcs that look kind of like this. And it doesn't matter how you draw it out, whether you just draw it out with the brush or whether you draw it out with a line. It doesn't matter. Just get that arc looking something like this. And what this arc represents is how the path that the ball will sort of follow over time when you animate that ball. What we're also doing is working out the staging of the current animation. So we're trying to figure out exactly what we're going to see on the screen. So in this case, I've staged the animation to have 5 bounces of the ball before it starts to roll on the ground. That's the staging. That's how the composition of this shot is going to look in this particular scene. The goal here is to eliminate any complicated thought processes that will go on later down the track. The goal is to think less over time, not think more over time about the animation. You want to feel relaxed once you get to the polish stage. You don't want to have more problems, you want to have less problems. So what we're essentially doing is creating a blocking layer. And that blocking layer, for instance, is this arc. And then we're going to work out our timing as well. So as you can see here, with this line that I've created, I've actually created it on a guide layer in the timeline. I'm also adding a secondary layer, which will represent the line where the ground plane sits in this particular animation. So I'm just working out exactly where the ball will hit the ground. And that's really important when you're animating a ball bounce in a traditional way, because you don't want to accidentally have the ball slightly roll down a hill that doesn't exist. You want to have it hit the ground in the same spot in terms of height. So having that ground layer will help a lot here. So in this case, I'm going to represent the ground with a green line, at least for now. Just draw a straight line, and that will represent where the ball will hit the ground. And again, there's no hard and fast rules here. You can use whatever color you want, any color you want, any line thickness you want, or even a solid shape. Up to you. And just to prove it, I've changed the color to a blue line. There you go. All right, the next stage is to work out the timing of the animation, and that's done really simply. In the case of a ball bounce, at least, it's really simple to do. And what we're going to do is draw a series of little lines along this arc, and these little lines will represent a frame of drawings. So each line represents a frame of animation in which we will add a drawing of the ball. So obviously we'll need a frame at the peak of the ball bounces. So at the top of the arc, so I'm going to add a line on the top of every arc, and that will represent a frame of animation that the ball will sit on. Then as the ball accelerates and decelerates, we need to figure out the spacing between how we get from point A to point B to point C to point D. And I'm spacing out the lines in a way that will be indicative of acceleration and deceleration. The further the lines are spaced apart, the faster the animation will be between each frame. The closer the lines are, or the closer the frames are with each drawing, the slower the animation will appear on the screen. So we're adding acceleration and deceleration over time. And then finally, once the ball stops bouncing and slows down on the ground, the lines get closer and closer and closer together until the ball comes to a stop. So already by doing these very simple things, we've already figured out our staging, our arcs, our timing, and in some ways our appeal. And the great thing about doing this first is that we haven't even had to draw a frame yet, a single frame. We haven't had to do anything yet. And that will make the next stage a lot easier, which is actually, as you may guessed it, animation time. And just so you know, if you want to try something different to what I've drawn here, feel free to experiment. Feel free to add more drawings, more frames in between the A to B start and end, because that way you'll get an understanding and a feel of how fast and how slow an object needs to move to feel realistic or at least appealing on the screen. Okay, as you may have guessed, it's time to start animating. Now, if you planned out your staging and timing as I did before, you should require much less brain power to actually draw the frames to do the ball bounce. You should actually require less effort now that you've done the planning. So just draw the ball, stupid. I'm just kidding, but still, you understand what I mean here. It should require less effort now that you've done the hard work. Okay, so the way that this is going to work is that I'm going to draw a drawing on every second frame of my animation, or on my timeline, every second frame of my timeline. And that is what is called animating on twos. So I'm essentially drawing at 12 frames a second. Even though the timeline is 24 frames a second, I just have to make sure that I'm drawing on every second frame. So 1, 3, 5, 7, etc. So as I draw down the timeline, I'm basically going to be drawing on every single little mark that I've added on that arc, on those arcs, which will eventually lead to the creation of the animation itself. But before I do that, I'm going to add a little bit of personality to this ball by adding some anticipation to the movement. So before the ball launches up, I'm going to almost make it feel like the ball's a little bit more alive by squishing down the ball on the third frame of this animation, squishing it down and giving it a little bit of energy before it shoots itself back up. So I'm going to do the same thing on frame 5. So I'm going to block out another frame where it's even more squished. So I'm going to get it, storing up all that energy before it launches itself off. So we're adding some squash and stretch here and some anticipation at the same time. And if you're doing this for the first time, feel free to write some notes on your blocking layer and just say, oh yep, squash and stretch, anticipation. This is where I'm going to add these things over time. So you can actually add little notations along your animation in the blocking layer, which I've done here, to remind myself this is what this is for. This is what my intention is in this animation. So now that I've done that anticipation, I can now go to my frame 7 and start to draw the first launching of that ball right on that first marker on frame 7. And at the same time, I'm adding some stretch to this thing so I can really make it feel like it's moving quickly, because it's moved quite a bit of space over time. So it's gone from being on the ground to literally launching into midair. And by adding some stretch to that ball, I'm essentially mimicking motion blur from a film camera. Now I'm going to point out a mistake I just made in my animation. I've accidentally drawn a second drawing on frame 7, which should have been on frame 9. That's my mistake. But later on, you can always go back and fix that. That's the nice thing about this practice run, is that you can actually start to see mistakes you make. In any case, this method makes it way easier to start going from next frame to the next frame to the next frame to start drawing your ball bounce. You can see here that I'm just going from one frame to the next frame and literally drawing right on that line that I've blocked out in my staging and timing phase. And because I'm treating it so mindlessly, that's probably why I made the mistake in the first place. But you can see here that I'm literally just using the marker from that blocking as a place to put my next drawing on each frame. So literally draw a frame, go to the next 2 frames forward, draw a next frame. And if you make a mistake and draw on a wrong frame, you can always move that keyframe across on the timeline, as you can see at the bottom of this video. But this is also showing the shortcomings of the current method of animation that I'm doing right now, which is called straight ahead animation, where I'm literally drawing one frame after another. It's prone to making mistakes. You're prone to be making mistakes when you do it this way, because you're just going one frame, next frame, next frame, next frame, and drawing drawings one after another. So another way you can do this is by doing a pose-to-pose method, where you're drawing in between major or extreme poses along the timeline. So I'm going to show you how to do that with the next bounce. But you can see here that I'm just drawing my next few frames, stretching as it falls, as it accelerates, to make it feel like it's moving faster before it hits the ground. And then once it actually does hit the ground, I'm instantly going to draw it squished. So it's going to look like it squishes on the ground, and then it will just launch off again in the next frame. So as you can see here, literally just drawing that ball squishing down on the ground as it absorbs, as the ground absorbs all that energy from the ball bounce. As the ball hits the ground, it keeps on moving down, and we're exaggerating that squish. So a quick playback of that bounce, the first bounce, and you can see it's already got a little bit of personality in it. We've got some squash and stretch going there. We've got some anticipation. So the ball is squishing down before it launches up, and it's starting to come alive very quickly, mind you, within a few minutes. What you've seen me draw has been the exact amount of time it took me to draw these things. And without that planning, it probably would have taken double, maybe triple the amount of time to get right. So for this next bounce, I'm actually going to be a bit more methodical with which drawing I draw first. So as you can see here, I've just labeled how many frames it will take to get from the squash state to the top of the arc. And it will take 4 frames of drawings to do that. So because I'm animating on 2s, I'm gonna move forward 8 frames on my timeline and then draw my ball at the top of the arc. And by doing that, I know that I have the exact amount of frames needed to fill in the gaps, so the in-betweens between those different states. Same thing goes for when the ball hits the ground. I've got 4 frames in which I need to fill in between the next hit on the ground. And you can see here, because the ball bounce is reducing in power, I've made the squash a little less intense than the previous bounce hit. So making that feel like it's losing energy over time as well, with less stretch and squash. Now this method of basically setting out your extreme poses first and then drawing the frames in between later is called pose-to-pose animation. This is a much more planned and a much more methodical method of animation, but it's also a much more easier to control method of animation where you are less prone to be making mistakes. Now you may notice I can actually see a sort of ghost of the previous frames and the forward frames of this animation. This is called onion skinning. If you can't see that in your Blender file, make sure you turn that on and set it to around 4 frames positive and negative to your current drawing. That way you can see forward and backward in time and draw your in-betweens without worrying about where the ball is before and after those poses. So as you can see here, drawing those in-betweens becomes really, really easy because you know exactly where the start state and the end state of those 2 different poses will be, that you can start to draw the in-betweens really easily. Coupled with the markers that we've added in the blocking, it starts to get really, really easy to start to fill in those blanks. I'm essentially working mindlessly at this point because I've done all that planning. Now, once I've finished this last drawing, you can start to see it really come to life once we play back the animation. So a quick little playback, and you can see it's really starting to look a little bouncy. So really starting to come to life now. We're starting to get those two bounces looking really good. The rest of the bounces basically become naturally, you can just do it naturally at this point. So I'm not going to go through the entire process of me drawing every single frame in real time. That would just be ridiculously boring. That's the thing about animation. It's very repetitive, all right? It's fun to do, but it's not fun to see people do very often. So you can see here, I'm just going straight ahead and drawing all my frames. And again, I'm reducing the squash and stretch with each consecutive bounce to make it feel like it's also losing less energy. So by the time we get to the last bounce, there's no squash and stretch at all. The only thing that's indicative of the motion slowing down is the spacing between the drawings. And that's where that initial blocking comes into play. The closer the balls are, or the drawings are between each frame, the slower the animation starts to look. And you see here, the bounce is really starting to look like a natural bounce. So this is playing back in real time. So it's playing back at 25 or 24 frames a second. And you can see here that I've made a few mistakes again because I was drawing straight ahead and I was acting mindlessly. A way to fix a double up on the frames is simply just take your frames, move them forward a little bit, and then if you've drawn two frames on the same frame, just erase one of the drawings. In my case, I'm just going to delete it, or I think I just use the eraser tool. Yep, I just use the eraser tool. And then redraw that pose on the next frame. So if you doubled up by accident, like I've done here, just erase that ball, go to your next frame, or clean up this first, then go to your next frame. And you can see here, I did the same thing again. I made the same mistake. I put it in the wrong frame, but I've just had to slide it across a long time. So you can see here, playing it back, and it looks really, really natural, really cartoony. Obviously, depending on the style of animation you're going for, you may want to make it look more realistic, or you may want to exaggerate it even further. And one last thing, you can see here that I'm slowing down the animation. I'm easing it down. It's called slow out in a more traditional sense, where I'm spacing the ball closer and closer to one another in each frame to make it feel like it's decelerating over time to a complete stop. That's the only way you'll make it feel like a natural thing. It will feel more natural if the ball decelerates over time. Don't just have it suddenly stop. It just looks robotic as fuck. The other thing a good animator does is just constantly play back the motion and just look at it. And just look at it and see if there's any other things that look out of place. If it doesn't look at anything out of place, then you're probably on the right track. Or you can get someone else to look at it and get them to look at it. Alright, the final stage is polish. And I'll tell you right now, if you've done everything else right up until this point, polish should require absolutely zero brain power. I'm talking you can have your deathcore tracks playing at full tilt and you shouldn't even be able to bat an eye. You should just be like, just drawing away, no problem. You're basically just tracing, but with a more precise line. Much, much simpler. You can see here, I'm using a more refined brush. I'm not changing the animation by any means. I'm just fixing up that one mistake I made at the start. But other than that, I'm literally just tracing over the exact same animation, but with a much finer line, and making sure that my lines are clean and just repeating that process again. I'm not even thinking about the placement of the balls because they're already there. I don't have to think about it. It's right there in front of me. I'm just tracing the image over and over again. Until I get to the end. Once I've done that, I can go to my fills layer and just use the fill brush or the fill tool. I'm just going to give it a red fill. And there's a reason why I'm speeding this up, because it's so brain dead that anyone can figure this out. I'm telling you right now, it's really simple. If you don't know how the fill tool works in Blender with grease pencil, again, check out the official videos on how to use it. It's really simple. It's like any other tool, really. It's very similar to Adobe Animate and how it works. In some cases, the fill might not work because you haven't closed the line properly, but other than that, it's super simple. And the great thing is it will actually understand lines from another layer to fill in, so you don't have to worry about it all being on the same layer. So a few little bits of cleanup here and there, just making sure that I didn't accidentally fill in the wrong layer. And the ball bounce is essentially done. So that's been polished up, the color's in there, all good to go. The general rule of thumb, in my opinion, is that all the headaches that you may have about the animation should be dealt with as soon as possible when you start to block out your animation. If you find yourself animating and things are getting more complicated over time, or feeling like they're getting more complicated over time, like you're constantly trying to fix things that shouldn't have to be fixed, or you're working on problems that are essentially something that could have been fixed in the blocking stage, then you're basically doing it wrong, in my opinion. What you need to be doing is establishing the core idea as early as possible in any animation, even as something as simple as a ball bounce. And we're going to talk about more about this sort of stuff in the future, especially when it comes to weight, transferring the weight of certain animations. I've ignored it here for now, but there's a reason why. So out of this animation, we have essentially tried to learn about a bunch of those animation principles. And I think we've done it with this very simple ball bounce. So at the start of all this, we carefully figured out our staging, our timing, and our arcs. As we drew those frames in the blocking stage, we figured out our squash and stretch, anticipation, and exaggeration of the motion. So with that squash and stretch, we are accentuating the exaggeration of that motion. During this process, we tried the two methods of animation, which was straight ahead animation and pose to pose animation. And we discovered the pros and cons of each method. But we haven't done two things though, which was the follow through and the overlapping action, and finally any secondary action. And that's simply because it's a ball. There's none of that involved in this motion. There's none of that to be concerned about. But in the future, we will cover that to some degree. Now, in terms of solid drawing, that's really up to you and what kind of style you're going for. But in my case, I just add a little bit of shading with the effects tab inside of Blender to get some shadow and some highlight. And I think that counts. How you add that sort of solidness or solidity to those motions is up to you and what you're drawing. So I haven't gone into any much detail there, but I'll count it if only just to show you the fact that you can do it. Now, finally, is it appealing? Well, I don't know. That's purely up to you. So feel free to leave a comment below. Give this video a like, subscribe, do whatever you want to do. If you want to get the source files and get this video ad-free, feel free to sign up to my Patreon. This is just the first of many animation videos I'm going to be putting out there. So if you're really interested in that, feel free to sign up. In any case, no matter what you do, thank you for watching. And all I'm going to say is catches and have fun. Cheers.